Hey team! We just finished talking about meiosis and the process of making gametes. Now we're going to talk about what happens when that process doesn't function properly, right? So errors in meiosis. So the first type of error that can occur in meiosis is non-disjunction of sister chromatids during anaphase 2. So if those sister chromatids that are connected together at that centromere, if they do not separate properly, so if they stay connected, one of those gametes is going to get an extra chromosome, and the other gamete is going to be lacking a chromosome. So that non-disjunction can cause some cells, if they are used for reproduction, that some of those cells can have more or too few chromosomes. This is most common for chromosome 21, which we call when there's 3 copies of chromosome 21, when those sister chromatids of chromosome 21 did not separate. And then usually if it's the resulting egg cell has 2 copies of chromosome 21, when it's only supposed to have 1. If that resulting egg cell that has that extra copy of chromosome 21 is fertilized, that sperm brings in a 3rd copy of chromosome 21. So trisomy meaning 3 copies of that chromosome. So trisomy 21 is also known as Down syndrome. It's associated with certain developmental disorders and things like that. But that's all it's caused by. It's just having 1 extra chromosome right here, chromosome 21. If there's extra chromosomes of the rest of these ones, other chromosomes 1 through 20 or 22, usually that egg is caught to be non-viable, it's not used, or if an egg does have an extra copy of a chromosome, of these other chromosome numbers, 1 through 20 and 22, and it does have an extra copy of those, and it's fertilized, then usually that resulting zygote, that embryo, would not be viable. All right, so it would go through apoptosis usually in that scenario. But with trisomy 21, that doesn't trigger apoptosis of that zygote. The other common trisomy, or what we call aneuploidy is having extra or too few chromosomes at a certain location. Other common aneuploidies are having 3 X chromosomes, so what we call triple X syndrome. There's no fancy name for this syndrome. This is just when a female, most typical females have 2 X chromosomes. In triple X syndrome, there's non-disjunction of the X chromosome, and the resulting zygote after fertilization then has 3 copies of that X chromosome. So this triple X chromosome is about 1 in 1,000 newborn baby girls that do not show any obvious symptoms, and they usually don't know that they have triple X syndrome. The only symptom that we really can tie all of these triple X females together with is they tend to be taller than usual, but even then that's not necessarily a very good indicator of whether or not they have triple X syndrome. For the most part, most people that have triple X syndrome, they wouldn't know unless they got karyotyped. XXY, also called Klinefelter syndrome. This is when there's 2 copies of the X chromosome and 1 Y chromosome. People with this karyotype would typically present as male. It's going to affect about 1 in 650 newborn boys every year, and it's associated with more female-like characteristics, meaning during development, not as much testosterone is produced, and there's going to be thinner facial hair, maybe a fat distribution that's more similar to what we see in females, meaning fat tends to be distributed around the hips and the buttocks, versus in males, fat distribution tends to be around the stomach. So they still present as male. Their testes might be smaller and they may not produce as much testosterone, and they're going to have some slightly female characteristics. But this can be augmented, this Klinefelter syndrome can be augmented and treated with hormone therapy. And then XYY is when we have 1 X and 2 Y chromosomes. These people would also present as males. It's about 1 in 1,000 newborn boys that present with this syndrome. It doesn't have a name. It often goes undiagnosed. There are some associations of XYY with some developmental issues, maybe some learning issues as well, but they're not a very common set of symptoms. There's no one set of symptoms that everybody that has XYY has. And then lastly, this one right here, XX0, that means that there's 1 X chromosome and then nothing else. There's no other X, there's no Y, there's just one X chromosome. This is also called Turner syndrome. And individuals that have Turner syndrome present as female. And people exist with one X chromosome and no Y chromosome. Because on the Y chromosome, there's not really anything on there besides produce male hormones and produce testes. And the X chromosome is much larger than the Y chromosome. And so just having one X chromosome, these individuals still present as female. They typically are going to have lower female hormones concentrations, so lower estrogen levels than a typical XX female. But this, again, can also be treated with hormone therapy if it's caught early enough. So these aneuploidies, having extra or too few chromosomes, is caused by non-disjunction in anaphase 2. Now, what if something goes wrong during prophase 1 of meiosis 1? So remember, if in prophase 1, this is where we have the crossing over, where tetrads are going to line up and then they're going to swap their DNA, right? If there's an error in that process of crossing over, where maybe one chromosome gets extra DNA and one chromosome gets not enough DNA, that means that there's one chromosome will have too much DNA and the other one will have too little. And either scenario can be bad. Either scenario, having too much or too little DNA on a given chromosome can be bad. Oftentimes it is fatal. One example that we're going to talk about of this errors in chromosome structure comes with chromosome number 5. During crossing over, parts of chromosome number 5 are deleted, and so that chromosome 5 is shorter than what it would typically be. And this causes a syndrome known as Cru-du-Chat syndrome, which is translated to cry of the cat. And this is characterized by intellectual disability, delayed development, smaller head sizes, low birth weight, oftentimes a weak muscle tone in infancy, and other distinctive facial features. Then severity of Cru-du-Chat depends on how much of that chromosome is missing. The more chromosome 5 is missing, the more severe this syndrome is going to present as. And this disease ranges from anywhere from 1 to 15,000 or maybe 1 in 50,000 newborn and live-born infants. All right, so this is what can happen when there is an error during meiosis and how some of these syndromes come about.